Mahesh, thank you so much for joining us today.
No
I
problem. I'm
believe,
glad to be here.
I believe you would have had a wonderful journey being a writer. That too, as a budding writer, you would have had a lot to learn about.
Um, Wonderful. It is leaves something to say about it, but it definitely was a journey. This was not something that I was planning on doing. This, I mean, even last year, 2020 January, if you had asked me, like, oh, so you're going to be an author, and I'll be like, no. So this was something that was never something that I was about to do. I did what I used to do is I generally used to write down like lines of stories whenever I travel a lot. So from all the stories that I hear from a lot of people, if the interesting ones, I generally make a note about it because like it may be useful for me to reference it somewhere into the future or work it into a conversation, something like that. And I lived in New Orleans for a while, and storytelling over there is on a completely different platform. Um, so, I mean, you know that like the vampires and zombies originated
Yes,
in New Orleans.
yes.
So, and living there was, I mean, I can quietly say that we had some quite eerie experiences in the house that I was living in, and not just me, all of my roommates did. And we left the house after a year. So that was my first experience with the paranormal from New Orleans. But anyway, that is a completely different take. But you know, from that point onwards, I actually started making a lot of notes about different things. And whenever I watch movies, I used to wonder, what if this character made this decision instead of what she actually did or he actually did? How would that affect the ending of the movie? Or how would that take the story? And I used to write like a page and see if I like it or not. Most of the times what the director did was better, and where I went goes into a dead end. But sometimes I used to think, maybe they should have actually done this. It could have, given them an opportunity to do a sequel, or I would have preferred this ending. So that was how initially all my uh, let's say my thirst for writing something started.
That prompted you to
And
become a writer, moreover.
kind of. And one major thing that did prompt me to write something, to start writing something, was when I went to the Tanjore big temple,
Yeah,
Brihadishwara temple. I went there, and there was a lot of things where, and I mean, sorry, they gave us a tour. The Archaeological Institute gave us a tour about the different parts of the temple, the rooms that were built inside the temple that generally is not open to public access. And the more I got to see all that, and it opened up more questions than answers, because even the archaeological survey didn't have a lot of answers as to why that particular thing was there. What was the reason behind building this structure? So and I tried to come up with reasons. You know, the human brain always wants to connect something. If there's nothing that is not known, it is going to try and figure out what happened. And so I ended up writing like, okay, so if this was the reason for this, it could have been because of this. And this was way back in 2008. And I just written it and I forgotten about it. And then as I started traveling a lot from like 2010, as I started working and I started making a little bit more money for me to actually start traveling around everywhere. Every city that I went to, they have some kind of a local folk story if you just talk to the locals, and they're really interesting. And there's a lot of similarities to the stories that they tell in like different parts of the world. And that's kind of when I found out where, um, there's a lot of similarities between the temples that are built here and in Cambodia, the entire Southeast Asian regions.
yes.
So, I mean, that prompted me to make a few more notes and things like this. And since I am a management consultant working with a majority of computer firms, and artificial intelligence is one of the areas that my company deals with, there's a ton of ideas there. what if they run amok, everything from like starting. And I can be really honest with you, like even Elon Musk says, if AI is not properly regulated, you never know what it's going to lead to.
So can we say AI is your inspiration?
To a couple of the stories in this book, yes, it is. AI and the zeal for the thirst for human knowledge, um, where you tend to break boundaries.
That's
You
wonderful.
know, there are certain areas that they say is forbidden, and the human curiosity wants to go beyond that point and see what is behind that door. So it's, yeah, it's stories like that. Um, and while writing this, I didn't know if I was going to actually make it into a book. I wrote one story and I just gave it to a few people close to me, and they all liked it. And one of them actually passed it on to her professor, who happens to be one of the journalists in the Hindu.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And he read this and he's like, "Oh, this is nice. How many books has he written?" And she's like, "No, books. This is the first story he's ever written." And then he got in touch with me and he wanted me to write more. And so that gave me the boost to actually, okay, so let me select a few stories and then let me expand on them. So I wouldn't really say these are short stories per se. So I say these are short-ish because they range from like 4,500 words to almost a novella at like 16,000 words.
That's wonderful, actually. Uh, and Mahesh, so you're a management consultant, right?
Yes.
Uh, so as you said, speculative fiction. Can we expect some kind of a management flavor in your upcoming book, in your upcoming first book, rather, I must say?
Um, well, there is a lot of stories about, without giving anything away, mismanagement. So that kind of comes
Mismanagement.
from, yeah, that kind of comes from uh, work experience, you can say that. But it is not, there are no stories that deal directly with anything that is related to my management consulting experience. But there are stories, like I said, that involve um, with actions that if you're if there are boundaries for a reason and what happens if you cross those boundaries.
Okay. So, in a nutshell, would you like to tell us what to expect and what not to expect from your first book?
I call this book Illusions of Control because every hero in each story has a clear plan as to how they should achieve what their end goal is. Like almost all of us on a daily basis. Um, so, what actually inspired me to write this book, apart from the reasons that I had mentioned earlier, is I had a lot of plans for 2020. The whole thing went down the drain when the coronavirus pandemic and lockdown started. So it's the plan's never a straight line, right? No matter what you do, even if you're trying to do something, so it always goes up and down. There are going to be pits. You need to overcome all that. So taking into all those struggles and how in the future or how things that you've already done is going to affect you is how what these stories are based on. So read the book with an open mind. That's what I would say. Don't assume anything about the book, because I'm a first time author, so I haven't done anything overtly complicated with the book. They're all pretty much straightforward stories, except one where I did try and attempt something a little different. When people actually told me initially, like, I don't think you should go there, but it might not come out very well. But I did attempt it, and people did like the end product, so it is there. And I've written, I mean, I did 7 stories because not 10, not a round number, because these were the seven stories that I was happy with. I didn't want any filler stories. So I was happy with the content that I had for these seven stories. And I'm like, no, this is what I'm going to do right now. And this will tell me if the book is actually, if I'm actually working well as an author or not. So when you read the book, what I would say is don't have any expectations as to, oh, this is this kind of a book. Oh, this is that kind of a book. Because each story has a slightly different tone to it. And speculative fiction is because every scenario and every um, area that the characters travel to is imagined. That's the only reason I've kept it as speculative fiction.
That's nice. That's very nice, actually. No, creating a specific genre out of what already exists, something more creative, and we hope that your book could be more creative and it becomes one of the best selling too as it
Thank you.
enters the market. Yeah. And one last question, Mahesh.
Yeah.
So now that you've written Illusions of Control with as something that deals with human behavior, now I'm sure you would have made some plans for your next book
Hmm.
or your series of books for that matter.
Um, Actually, I wouldn't say series of books, but initially, what prompted me to um, write this first short story is because I wanted. There's this other story that I have in my head, and that stems from me visiting the Brihadishwara temple. It's based on Indian mythology. But as I started putting the words together and I started putting the ideas together, it just started becoming such a huge, daunting task. And I was like, there's no way I can write this. I can't even finish the outline. It's crossing paths in so many different areas and directions. And I just left it. I have like, about 30, 40 pages of scribbles that is just sitting in a file. And it's been there for almost 10 years now. And I mean, like, work gets in the way and I just never couldn't do it. But then last year I had the opportunity to actually go through all those old notes, and I'm like, wait, there are some interesting things in here. Let me start putting this into words. And then I started typing, and again I felt overwhelmed. So then my wife actually told me, like, why don't you start with something small? Why don't you just, like, write a short story? You have so many different snips from so many of your travels, so why don't you do that? I'm like, yeah, that's actually a good idea. And I started writing that first story, and that story, like, went like the path that I had told you earlier. So this entire book is an exercise for me to see if I can actually write that next story. And I think eventually I might end up sitting to write it, but I don't know when that's going to be.
Okay. So thank you so much for joining us today, Mahesh. It was
Thank you
indeed
for having
a
me.
great conversation with you. So, getting to know all your travel experiences and your perspective towards travel, your perspective towards everything else is really amazing. Now, we just can't wait for your book to launch. And again, as I said before, we are hoping that your book would be one of the best sellers in the market.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.